In part 1, I gave you a simple explanation of what modes are and how to think about them in a jazz context. The chord progression that we're using as an example is the basis for two famous tunes, So What by Miles Davis and Impressions by John Coltrane. The basic melody that Train wrote is itself a scale pattern, and I recommend learning this in all 12 keys. Like many tunes, this is a 32-bar form, and it can be divided into 4 8-bar sections, which we describe as AABA since the first, second, and fourth sections are the same. When you repeat a chorus, you wind up with 24 bars of D minor, from the last section through the first 2 sections. Now, this is a place where students often mess up, because after playing the first A of the second chorus, it's easy to feel that it's time to go to the B section, when in fact, there's another A section still to go. In a tune with a chord progression, the chords themselves help delineate the form. In a modal tune, the improviser has to internalize the form. Listening to the chords won't tell you where you are, except at the 2 spots where one chord changes to the other. The first step is to feel each of the 8 bars as a section and construct your melodic lines with that in mind. Now, even then, you may lose track of which of the A sections you're on. In that case, I suggest not playing across the transition from one section to the next, so that you can listen to see if the rhythm section moves up to the E flat minor. If you want to make it even more obvious to your ear, play a D and hold it right across the 8-bar transition. If the rhythm section does move up to the E flat minor, you're going to feel a strong pull to raise that note up to E flat. And if you do it assertively, you'll create tension and resolution that sounds like it was intentional. If keeping track of the form is one of the challenges when improvising on modal tunes, the other is keeping your lines interesting over long periods of static harmony. When you're improvising on chord changes, just making the changes alone, in other words, constructing your melodic lines so that they reflect or adhere to the changing harmony, creates a certain amount of interest, and it requires a certain amount of skill. But when you're looking at up to 24 bars of a single chord, well, it's going to get pretty monotonous if all you do is run up and down a D Dorian scale. Now, there are advanced concepts that include stepping outside the defined harmony, but I'm going to focus on what we can do inside the harmony, using scales that we've already talked about in previous episodes and that relate to the Dorian mode. The first thing I'm going to bring up is what I call dyadic melody construction. Now, it seems to me that dyad, spelled D-I-A-D, should be a musical term just like triad is. But Google identifies it only as a misspelling of the word dyad, spelled D-Y-A-D, which is defined as a pair of individuals maintaining a sociologically significant relationship. Now, there's also a couple of other definitions relating to math and genetics, but this one at least gets close to what I'm describing, which is a pair of notes, and specifically a pair of notes that form an interval of a third, that are adjacent to another pair of notes that also form an interval of a third. In the key of C, C and E would be a dyad, D and F would be the dyad above it, and B and D would be the dyad below it. E and G would also be a dyad, but they're not adjacent to C and E, so harmonically they're in the same family. If we put together those 2 dyads, we get a C major triad. And if I assign you to write or improvise an 8-bar melody using only the notes of a C triad, well, you can do it, but it's going to be hard to make it very interesting. Now, if you also have access to the dyads that are between those 3 notes, which are drawn from the other 4 notes of the scale, well, then you can construct a melody that actually sounds like a melody. Of course, this is a very simple melody, and it's an example of what I call nursery rhyme melody construction. Although a tune like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star may seem like child's play, notwithstanding that it's credited to one of the greatest composers who ever lived, many of the standard tunes that jazz musicians like to improvise on have melodies that are not much more complex. In each of those three examples, the melody notes are diatonic, which means they're derived from a single scale. Even if you look at the full tunes, there's only one non-diatonic note in the melodies for Bye Blackbird and There'll Never Be Another You, and there's only two of them in Stella By Starlight. Now this is true for most standard tunes. The melodies are largely, and in some cases, entirely diatonic. When you add the chords to the melody, the tunes do take on greater depth, but a good melody doesn't rely on the chords. It sounds good all by itself. So when we're improvising on a modal tune, the fact that the chord stays the same for a long time doesn't prohibit us from constructing melodic lines. Diadic melody construction gives you a way to imply a harmonic shift, even while staying within an overall tonality. You can find an example in the first four and the last three notes of the melody to impressions. We can apply this concept to the Dorian scale, working with lines that move by steps or by thirds. Pentatonic scales are a logical extension of this idea because they combine steps and thirds, which makes the lines more interesting while staying within the Dorian tonality. Each Dorian scale actually generates three possible minor pentatonic scales built on the first degree, the second degree, and the sixth degree. Adding the sharp 4 or the flat 5 to the minor pentatonic scale turns it into a blues scale. Just as when we use this scale on the blues, this note adds a strong color and it introduces chromaticism into your lines. Every minor 7 chord has a related dominant 7 chord that comes from the same key or pool of notes. For the D minor 7 chord, the related dominant chord is G7, and for the E flat minor 7 chord, the related dominant chord is A flat 7. So you can use the Mixolydian scales that are associated with dominant chords. D Dorian and G Mixolydian contain the same notes, but thinking of one or the other changes the emphasis of the notes in your lines. If you add the major 7 passing tone to a Mixolydian scale, you get a bebop scale, and then we've introduced yet another element of chromaticism. The bebop scale is the most common device that jazz musicians use to construct eighth note lines. Now I'm going to let you hear all of those melodic ideas in sequence, using a backing track, but I'm going to mute the piano so that you can hear the way the lines bring out the harmony, even with just a walking bass line. The Jamie Aebersold recordings are really great for this because the piano is in one channel and the bass is in the other, with drums in both. When you're working with these recordings, I recommend playing around with a balance. Sometimes just bass, sometimes just piano, and then various proportions of the two.